Welcome guys to part 4 in my documentary series on the First Punic War. This episode is going to be entitled Final Breath. In 256 BC, Romans capitalized on their decisive victory at the Battle of Ecnomus and sailed their massive fleet across the Mediterranean headed towards North Africa. The two consuls, Lucius Manlius Vulso and Marcus Attalus Regulus, led the full-scale invasion to Cape Bon and landed near the city of Aspis. Ships were drawn onto the beach while a ditch and rampart were erected to defend them. The invasion force struck out at the nearby garrison at Aspis, besieging and soon capturing that lightly defended town. Romans were now unopposed and loose on enemy soil. They quickly caused chaos by raiding the surroundings, gathering cattle, and collecting over 20,000 slaves and deserters. Rome then sent orders commanding one of the consuls to return to Italy with the fleet and captured loot. Vulso returned with most of the ships and plunder in tow, but left a small group of around 40 ships to support the force in Africa. Regulus had stayed behind with the legions and had an army of 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry at his disposal. The proportion of mounted to foot troops was extremely low, given the complexity of transporting large numbers of horses overseas. Those that did make it were severely malnourished and had trouble in battles. This would prove to be a relatively decisive factor in the engagements that would follow. Meanwhile, the Carthaginians were scrambling to respond to the imminent danger. They decided not to directly oppose the Roman landing due to the recent devastating blows suffered by the fleet. Instead, the Punic High Command looked to the immediate defense of the city of Carthage itself. Two new generals were elected, Hasdrubal, son of Hanno, and Bostar. Additionally, Hamilcar was recalled from his command in Sicily, along with 5,000 soldiers and 500 horsemen. Historical details are sparse, but it is generally assumed that the three generals helped join command and rallied a force of comparative size to the Romans, but bolstered it with more cavalry and elephants. In late 216 BC, Regulus pushed out and began to besiege the town of Attis. The Carthaginians set forth to relieve the city and entrenched themselves atop a hill near the Roman camp. This Punic force stationed itself to overlook the Roman siege works and threaten the position. However, they refused to advance further, erring on the side of caution. It's at this point, however, that the Romans spotted an opportunity. They reasoned that the broken ground on which the Carthaginians were stationed would actually be an impediment to their own cavalry and elephants. In a bold move, Regulus decided to assault the hilltop position. Polybius seems to indicate that the Romans attacked at dawn, most likely following a concealed nighttime approach. Two Roman columns approached from opposite directions. In their way stood a group of mercenaries who had hastily assembled once the alarm was raised. These Punic forces were able to drive back the first legions, but were themselves attacked from the rear by the second Roman force and routed. The collapse of this guard force triggered a panic within the camp and led to its rushed evacuation. The bold attack was an incredible success, although most of the Carthaginian cavalry and elephants managed to escape unscathed. It should be noted, however, that the assault could have easily resulted in disaster had the attack been properly scouted and effective defense mounted. In any case, the Romans capitalized on their good fortunes and proceeded to seize the nearby city of Tunis. From this point, Regulus was able to continue his ravaging of the surrounding territory. Panic now gripped the city of Carthage. Their fleet had been sunk, their defensive army destroyed, and now the Numidian kingdoms were rising up in revolt to the south. To make matters worse, refugees from the countryside now streamed to the city of Carthage, swelling the population dramatically and straining the food supplies. Regulus was now in a strong position, but ironically he feared Rome the most at this point. His term of office had nearly ended, and he was now at risk of being called back from the front before ending the war on his terms and claiming victory. It is because of this threat that he decided to send peace envoys to Carthage. These messengers were welcomed eagerly. However, the mood of the city quickly soured when Regulus sought to impose a treaty which would force the Carthaginians to admit total defeat. the Carthaginians felt that the terms were far harsher than their actual fortunes in war warranted. The city was still far from admitting defeat and began to reform their army. During the winter of 255 BC, Greeks were recruited to help train the army. Principal among them was the Spartan-trained soldier Xanthippus. Xanthippus was openly critical of the recent Carthaginian failures and stressed that the cavalry and the elephants should have been used to maximum effect on an open plain. He was appointed then as a senior military advisor and became heavily involved in the retraining of the army. 12,000 infantry were drawn up, along with 4,000 cavalry and 100 elephants. The men were trained beneath the walls of Carthage, with Xanthippus drilling them on proper military command and maneuver. Morale quickly improved when the infantry was bolstered by the arrival of survivors from Hamilcar's Sicilian army. A new phalanx was also drafted, consisting of Carthaginian citizens. Seeing this change of heart in their opponents, the Romans decided to react quickly to destroy this ember of hope. They advanced to within a couple miles of the Punic camp, seeking to strike another decisive blow. The armies met on level plains. This was a deliberate move on the part of the Carthaginians, who had learned from their disastrous positioning in the last encounter with Rome. Xanthippus is given credit with the deployment of the Punic forces this time. The nearly 100 elephants were placed in a massive line a significant distance ahead of the main force. The citizen phalanx was placed in the center, with a large mercenary formation to their right. Cavalry and skirmishers were then split between the two flanks, supported by more mercenaries. Regulus was confident, but still remained wary of the elephants facing him. Polybius reports that he prepared for the elephants by forming the men many maniples deep. It is most likely that this means he deployed in the traditional triplex acies, but ensured that each maniple was actually formed up with more ranks. This added depth would help brace the men and bolster their morale in the face of a charge. The velites positioned themselves in front of the legions, while the relatively smaller cavalry force went to the wings. As the forces approached, their fronts proved to be the same width, with the exception of the elephants that did not stretch to cover the entirety of the Punic right flank. Both sides approached, with soldiers screaming and bashing their shields. Xanthippus ordered the elephants to attack. The enormous line of beasts surged towards the Roman front. Velites did their best to hold them back, but were unable to keep the wave from crashing on the infantry line. Elephants continued to deal casualties and disorder in the Roman ranks, but failed to shatter the deeper formations. 2,000 legionnaires on the Roman left were unaffected by this devastating charge and pressed forward. They encountered significant success and managed to break the Punic mercenaries, pursuing them off the battlefield. In the center, however, some Roman maniples and various small groups of troops were able to press past the elephant line. From there they were formed and launched an assault on the Carthaginian phalanx. The Punic infantry were more rested and numerous than the Romans and easily beat them back. At the same time, the Roman cavalry, who were outnumbered 4-1, cracked. Their retreat exposed the sides of the Roman infantry. Carthaginian cavalry now struck on both flanks as elephants continued to trample men from the front. The attacks from both sides forced the maniples to divert their attention from the front and led to a general collapse of the Roman line. Stand or retreat, the Romans were crushed by the elephants and cavalry as the fighting line disintegrated. Regulus and many of the troops were captured in the ensuing rout. Only the 2,000 legionnaires were able to fall back in good order to Aspis and rally the survivors. This provided a huge boost to Punic morale and signaled a turn of fortunes. The Numidian princes were beaten into submission, and Carthage even began to make gains back in Sicily. Newfound success may have had its dangers, however. According to some sources, Xanthippus seems to have fled Carthage, supposedly fearing the dangerous jealousy of some Carthaginian leaders. Later stories also claim that Regulus was sent back to Rome to negotiate prisoner exchange, but afterwards returned to Carthage to keep faith with an oath he had made, and was brutally executed. The remaining Romans holed up in North Africa would not be left to a similar fate. Rome sent an expedition of 350 ships to evacuate the defeated invasion force. Carthage was eager to inflict more losses on their enemies and sent 200 of their own vessels to engage the approaching flotilla. The fleets met off Cape Hermaeum. It seems that the scales of battle were tipped when the besieged legions in Africa sallied forth with 40 of their ships. In the ensuing battle, the Punic fleet was taken from both sides and forced to retreat. The African legions were now saved and successfully convoyed back to Sicily. Once in friendly territory, the Roman forces recuperated. They decided to recover some of the lost prestige following the African campaign and embarked on a display of force. This was achieved by sailing the fleet along southern Sicily in sight of the remaining Carthaginian cities with hopes of overawing them. These hopes were dashed with the appearance of a vicious storm in 255 BC. Romans were still inexperienced sailors and found themselves completely exposed when the tempest struck. In the dark fury, hundreds of ships snapped in half and sunk beneath the waves. Of the 364 vessels which had proudly sailed the day before, only 80 survived. Countless men died in the cold embrace of the deep. Carthage was quick to capitalize on the second major Roman tragedy in recent months. Territorial grabs were made in Sicily, and a force with 140 elephants was landed on the island. The sight of these large, massive animals scared the Roman troops who had heard horror stories from the disaster in Africa. Agrigentum was successfully taken back by the Carthaginians and burned to deny its use by the Romans before this attack force fell back. To the amazement of Carthage, Rome bounced back with alarming speed. If our sources are to be believed, in 254 BC, the Roman fleet was revived when 220 ships were built in a mere 3 months. This Herculean effort allowed Rome to retake the offensive. The new fleet regrouped at Messana with the remains of the old fleet and set sail for Panormus. Legions followed up the attack of the city by land. The walls were breached nearest the sea, and the city fell. Another assault was also launched at the heart of Punic power at Lilybaeum, though the offensive failed. The Roman fleet gained more success by crossing the Mediterranean to Africa. They conducted extensive raiding missions and captured huge hordes of plunder. In 253 BC, the fleet withdrew around the western tip of Sicily and made for a return voyage to Italy. A storm struck again, this time near Cape Palinurus in Italy. Almost 150 ships were lost. This once again dealt a devastating blow to Rome's campaigns at sea. The legions, however, remained largely undeterred and would seize Thermae and Lipara in the following year. In 251 BC, a protracted battle developed over Kephiladon, which is finally taken in 251 BC by the Romans. Hasdrubal planned a counteroffensive. In 250 BC, he left Lilybaeum with a large force intent on retaking Panormus. The Roman commander, Lucius Metellus, lured Hasdrubal into a false sense of security by feigning a reluctance to fight. The Romans deployed a screen of velites and picked maniples to harass the enemy as it crossed a river while advancing towards the city. This bait force was steadily fed reinforcements from Panormus and ordered to slowly pull back towards trenches that had been dug at the base of the city's walls. They did this to great effect, and Hasdrubal was drawn into an escalating fight over which he had less and less control. Punic elephant drivers charged and broke the thin Roman line, but then found themselves within range of defenders placed on the walls. Munitions had been stockpiled in anticipation of the Punic attack and were now being unleashed on the disorderly Carthaginians below. The elephants became wounded and were now sent stampeding right back into their own infantry forces behind them. At this point, Metellus unleashed a column of legionnaires who had been hiding on the inside of the gates off to the side of the battle. This strike force quickly seized on the panic of the Carthaginians and landed a decisive flanking attack that shattered the army. In the rout, a majority of the elephants were killed or captured, and large numbers of troops were taken captive. This decisive battle marked the last of the massed land engagements of the First Punic War. In its wake, Rome found renewed spirits. During the campaigning season of 250 BC, both consuls decided to bring the fight to Lilybæum once more, with the combined land and sea force totaling 110,000 men and 200 ships. Rome had improved their siege capability since the beginning of the war. The navy was primarily tasked with sealing off the harbor, while the army set to work constructing encircling fortifications. Early in the siege, however, Carthage sent a relieving force of 50 vessels carrying 10,000 mercenaries. These forces were able to use a favorable wind and their superior knowledge of the local shoal to sail into the harbor unopposed by the Romans in broad daylight. At night, the cavalry in the city were evacuated under the noses of unsuspecting forces. The removal of these unnecessary units helped to remove some hungry mouths from the city and compensate for the arrival of the newfound troops. The Roman commanders at sea were to be continually outdone by the skilled Punic sailors. A Carthaginian captain known as the Rhodian proved to be an extremely capable blockade runner. Numerous times he was able to outmaneuver the blockading ships. Even when 10 Roman ships were positioned to block his escape from the city, he still managed to humiliate his would-be captors and made it unopposed to the open sea. Instead of setting sail, the Rhodian offered battle to any who would dare attack him, an offer which the overawed Romans refused. In this way, the city was kept well supplied and in constant communication with Carthage. Rome then attempted to completely seal the harbor by dropping boulders in the channel. Though most of the stones were swept away, they caused enough of a buildup that one Carthaginian blockade runner got stuck during a night escape. The Romans seized the ship and discovered that it was an excellently constructed and nimble vessel. They then filled it with picked crew and a detachment of marines. When the Rhodian returned to Lilybæum, he found himself unable to outrun this repurposed Roman ship and was captured. The stranglehold over the city's port was now noticeably tighter. Throughout this period, Rome's fleet also continued to assist Roman land forces. The huge manpower which was normally needed to row 200 Roman ships was put to work in the construction of the siege works. While this helped speed up the process, it caused a significant attrition rate on the sailors, who suffered from disease in the crowded camps and also suffered at the hand of enemy action. In response, the Senate drafted 10,000 rowers and had them sent overland to Lilybæum. This did much to restore the strength of the fleet. Roman commanders judged that the reinforcements were not observed by the defenders and figured that an attack would not be expected. In 249 BC, the consul Publius Claudius Pulcher launched a surprise attack on the main Punic naval base at nearby Drepana. He figured that such a move would allow for the easy taking of a Carthaginian stronghold, and that the fall of this strategic base would precipitate the surrender of Lilybæum. The attack was staged at night. Claudius ordered his forces to advance along the coast, but in the darkness they lost formation. When the sun rose, the Carthaginians were made aware of the Romans' approach. It soon became a race, as the Punic admiral Adherbal ordered his force of about 100 ships to sea before he could be sealed into the port. This came as a bold move at the opportune moment, when the Romans were strung out in a long line, with Claudius's flagship stuck in the back. Just as the first Roman ships entered the south of the harbor, Adherbal's flagship led the escape from the north. The Romans realized the danger and attempted to reform. The order caused chaos. Collisions in the harbor ensued, and many Roman ships had their oars sheared off by friendly forces. Claudius was able to gather his fleet into a rugged line, but by that time was already outflanked. Adherbal ordered the attack and ran the disorganized Roman line into the shore. It seems that the Roman vessels were not equipped with the corvus and could not fend off the Carthaginians as they had at the Battle of Ecnomus. Now, the true skill of the Carthaginians shone through. They had also learned from past engagements and made sure ample groups of marines accompanied the sailors. Now with superior mobility, Adherbal's forces were able to ram and board the trapped Roman ships. The victory proved to be overwhelming. In all, around 93 Roman ships were sunk or captured, with only 30 making their escape. This was to be the first and only major naval victory celebrated by the Punic side. It would, however, be only the beginning of massive Roman setbacks at sea. Around the same time, the second consul of 249 BC, Lucius Junius Pullus, was leading a convoy to Lilybaeum. 120 warships escorted 800 transport vessels, which were carrying grain to resupply the besiegers. As the fleet made its advance, half of the force was halted to reform and wait for stragglers at Syracuse, while the rest pushed ahead. Meanwhile, the Carthaginians had sailed out from their victory at Drepana with 100 ships and attacked the Roman forces blocking the port of Lilybaeum. The Punic fleet caused serious havoc before retreating and making for the vulnerable Roman supply ships. The advanced Roman detachment, however, was forewarned of this danger by small scout ships that preceded the fleet. Rather than fight at sea, the Roman commanders had their ships drawn up on land by the nearest Roman-held town. There, they positioned their ships in a makeshift defensive line and reinforced the fortification with ballista from the town. This successfully deterred the Carthaginians from a major engagement and resulted in the loss of only several Roman ships. To the south, the majority of the Roman supply column was just rounding Cape Pacinus. Pullus was not aware of the recent Roman losses at the time, but remained wary of engaging such a strong Punic force. Instead, he led the mixed squadron of warships and transports cautiously along the coast. This move was observed by the Carthaginian admiral. Rather than engage in a similar fashion to the winning strategy at Drepana, he chose instead to sail immediately around the cape. This was done because the seasoned Carthaginian captains had spotted the signs of an approaching storm. They quickly ordered their ships to evacuate the exposed, rugged coast and seek shelter behind the cape. The Punic navy barely made it in time and was able to weather the gale in safety. The Romans, on the other hand, were caught in a punishing crosswind. With nowhere to escape, the entire fleet was smashed to pieces against the rocky cliffs. No certain count can be made of the sheer loss of life in this tragedy. However, the census at Rome, before and after the event, does show a drop of more than 50,000 citizens. This proved to be a devastating blow to Rome, especially in the wake of the disaster at Drepana. It would be several years before Rome could dare to tempt its fate at sea again. The battle on land, however, remained undiminished. At Lilybaeum the siege continued, but with little progress. Roman siege works were continuously counteracted by an extremely active defense force. Tunneling efforts successfully weakened many of Rome's attack ramps, while bold sallies by the Punic mercenaries continuously set fire to Rome's siege works. At the same time, the cavalry, which had been evacuated from the city, were landed further away and used to harass the enemy's rear lines. In this prolonged game of deadly attack and defend, the Romans suffered immensely due to Carthaginian actions and also deteriorating camp conditions. Despite this weakness, the Punic forces were never able to summon a large enough army to decisively break the siege. Instead, Hamilcar Barca resorted to guerrilla warfare. He arrived in Sicily in 247 BC to assume command of all Carthaginian land forces remaining on the island. This general is not only notable as an able commander, but also as the father of the famed Hannibal Barca. For nearly 3 years, he focused his attention on defending the vastly reduced territory remaining in Punic hands and stationed his base of operations near Panormus. From there, he would win many minor engagements, but a major victory would continue to elude him due to limited resources at his disposal. The lack of aid from Carthage can be traced back to the fact that resources had to be diverted to carry on campaigns against the tribes of North Africa. Nonetheless, in 244 BC, Hamilcar took the initiative and performed a surprise attack on the city of Ariox near Panormus and besieged nearby Romans for the rest of the year. By 243 BC, the Roman desire to return to sea was renewed. However, the state lacked the resources to create this new fleet and turned to private citizens for funds. The support poured in with the guarantee of repayment upon the recovery of the state's own funds. It is a testament to Rome's patriotic citizens that many did so with zero interest. Soon, 200 conquirums were assembled. In 242, the fleet was entrusted to the consul Caius Lutatius Catulus, who ensured that the sailors were trained daily until they had achieved a high level of proficiency. The Romans set about putting pressure on the harbors of Drepana and Lilybaeum. This had the dual effect of cutting off supplies to Hamilcar Barca and also provoking a response from the Carthaginian fleet. Carthage was slow to respond, but finally managed to assemble crews for 250 ships. While this force was exceptionally large, its captains had had to scrape the bottom of the barrel, so to speak, to find enough troops. As a result, the quality of this force was markedly lower than was typical. Faced off against Rome's well-drilled fleet, they may have even been, on average, less well-trained than their counterparts. Nonetheless, this fleet set off with the goal of finally supplying Hamilcar with the supplies and reinforcements he needed. It would then take on extra contingents of marines to seek out a decisive engagement with Rome. This naval force crossed the Mediterranean and halted at the westernmost of the Aegates Islands. There they awaited a favorable breeze to carry them the final stretch of the distance to Hamilcar's forces at Eryx. The Romans were by this time well aware of the huge Punic force's arrival. Catulus immediately boarded legionaries onto his ships and set out to intercept this force. He intended to prevent the Carthaginian fleet and army from linking up and joining forces. On the 10th of March, 241 BC, he was faced with a tough decision. The Punic fleet had finally found the favorable weather they needed to make the crossing and were setting sail for Eryx. This had to be prevented before Hamilcar's veteran troops could board the Carthaginian ships and make them substantially stronger. Contesting this crossing, however, meant fighting against the elements. The favorable winds which had aided the Punic crossing were blowing heavy swells towards the Romans. These weather conditions warranted serious consideration, given the numerous disasters which had befallen past Roman admirals, careless enough to ignore them. Catulus took the calculated risk and ordered his ships to attack. Roman crews battled through the high waves and proved capable sailors in pressing the assault. As this intercepting force approached, the Carthaginians were forced to drop their sails and prepare for battle. Despite having the weather acting against them, the Romans performed with demonstrable superiority. Punic crews were overloaded with supplies. As a result, they were extremely sluggish and outmaneuvered by the Roman ships that boarded or rammed them with near impunity. Over 50 Punic ships were sunk and an additional 70 captured. This is in contrast to the 30 Roman ships sunk and 50 crippled. The remaining Punic ships made their retreat when the winds changed course near the end of the battle. This battle of the Aegates Islands was decisive. Carthage was left with neither the resources nor the determination to raise another fleet in the face of such a defeat. Hamilcar and the remaining Punic strongholds were now fully isolated. Ultimately, this meant that any ember of hope for Carthaginian victory was snuffed out. Under these conditions, Hamilcar was given full authority to begin peace negotiations. Jubilation ensued in Rome as Catulus and the praetor Falto returned to celebrate a triumph for their final victory. The war had been won, but at great cost. Polybius claims that the Romans had suffered nearly 700 ships, with many of them going down with all hands, in terrible storms. Carthage suffered similarly high losses of around 500 warships, but the sailors aboard these were often saved or captured during the course of naval engagements. Yet despite these losses, Rome had persevered. On the whole, it can be said that Rome won the war because it was willing to risk more than the Carthaginians. Throughout the conflict, Roman commanders had shown relentless perseverance in pressing forward. This is epitomized by the invasion of Africa in 256. Although Regulus's expedition ended in disaster, it showed the degree to which Rome was willing to expand the scope of the war to achieve victory. Carthage, on the other hand, never positioned itself to deal a knockout blow to the Romans. Instead, they seemed more content to hold fast and respond to Roman moves. This behavior can be attributed to the differences in military structures discussed at the beginning of this series. Punic generals were for the most part long-term commanders who needed time to craft a cohesive force and would be wary of gambling that hard-earned force away. Rome, on the other hand, had annual commanders, who each sought to outdo the previous one in glory. This added greatly to the aggression of the legions, who themselves were constantly being reinforced by an enormous pool of manpower back in Italy, which could not be matched by the mercenaries of the Punic side. Slowly, but relentlessly, Carthage was forced back across Sicily. Roman aggression led to an escalation of the fighting, which is, in the end, to their advantage as well. At sea, this meant that the navies became enormous. In these titanic engagements, the Punic vessels had a hard time using their superior maneuverability to its fullest when surrounded by so many other ships. Add to this the ingenious development of the corvus, and the Romans were able to gain an advantage at sea through brute strength. Ultimately, control of the Mediterranean meant control of Sicily. When Carthage failed to contest Rome's final victory at the Aegates Islands, it was all over. The consul Catulus was eager to be the one to conclude the war and negotiated final terms. As victor, he was sure to treat Rome as undisputed champion, but he showed a small degree of leniency to speed up negotiations before a commander could be appointed to replace him. Hamilcar was able to gain, in this way, the concession that all his forces would be able to leave Sicily without surrendering their arms to Rome, thus safeguarding their honor. The rest of the terms dictated by Catulus, however, were highly punitive, and are as follows. First, Carthage must evacuate all forces from Sicily. Second, neither side was to be allowed to make war on the other's allies or become involved in the other's internal affairs. Third, Carthage must release all Roman prisoners at no cost, while Carthaginian prisoners would only be returned upon payment of a ransom. Fourth, Carthage must pay Rome 2,200 Euboean talents over the next 20 years. Rome would only approve the treaty by increasing the payments to 3,200 talents, with 1,000 payable immediately. In addition to leaving Sicily, Carthaginian forces must also evacuate all of the small islands between Sicily and Africa. This treaty was meant to be punishing. Roman diplomacy was always tied to war making, with both joined to utterly remove an opponent as a future threat. Oftentimes, a recently defeated entity would be made a subordinate ally to the Roman power, and its forces used to supplement the capacity of the legions. The sheer size of the Carthaginian territory and economy, however, made this approach impossible. It is this factor which had caused Rome to further increase the economic pressure on the treaty. These were expected to keep Carthage in check for the foreseeable future. Rome was perhaps too quick to judge the fate of this defeated power. Though Carthage became embroiled in brutal internal conflict following the First Punic War, they would bounce back. Punic advances into Spain, led by the Barcid family, allowed new wealth to pour into the city of Carthage. Trade networks were renewed, and agriculture flourished. To the amazement of Rome, Carthage was in a position to pay off the war indemnities well ahead of schedule. Carthage, the felled beast, was recovering from her wounds. These wounds had only proved to be temporary, but had festered with hate and a desire for revenge. This would ultimately lead to a renewed conflict between the two superpowers. Now, it would be Carthage's turn to strike at Italy.